Get your hands out of that bag before I call the police. Sophia Bennett's voice cut through the marble foyer like a blade, sharp enough that 3 passing staff members stopped mid-step just to watch. 7-year-old James Carter froze. His small fingers still curled around the strap of his backpack, the same faded navy backpack he carried to school every day. Patched at one corner with a strip of duct tape his grandfather had pressed on with his thumb. "I didn't take anything," James said. His voice cracked on the last word. Sophia didn't crouch down to his level. She didn't soften her tone the way adults are supposed to when speaking to a child. She stood over him in her cream silk blazer, diamond studs catching the chandelier light, and looked at him the way people look at something they've stepped in. "Children, like you don't wander around houses like this," she said. "Not without consequences." Around them, the household staff said nothing. A caterer setting up canapé trays in the next room slowed down to listen. A young maid bit her lip and looked away. Nobody moved to help. In houses like the Whitmore estate, silence was its own kind of obedience. Robert Carter, 67 years old, gardener's soil still under his fingernails, the collar of his flannel shirt soft from 100 washes, stepped forward, his hand raised in a slow, calming gesture, the kind meant to lower the temperature of a room rather than fight it. "He's 7, Robert said quietly. "Please, just look and let him go home." Sophia turned to the housekeeper standing near the door. "Lily, search his bag. Now," in front of everyone. Lily hesitated for half a second, long enough for James to catch her eyes and see something that looked almost like an apology before she crossed the floor and knelt in front of the boy. The zipper sounded impossibly loud in the silent hall. Lily's hand moved past the paperback, past 2 broken crayons, past a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in foil. Then her fingers found the small front pocket, and she went still. She pulled out a diamond bracelet. It caught the chandelier light exactly the way Sophia's had that morning because it was Sophia's. A collective gasp moved through the room like a current. Someone actually laughed. A short, ugly sound quickly swallowed. James stared at the bracelet in Lily's hand like it belonged to someone else's nightmare. For 1 second, something flickered across Sophia's face, not embarrassment, not guilt. Calculation. "Search the rest of it," she said. "Thoroughly. I want to know what else he's taken." Robert's jaw tightened. Han had spent his whole life learning when to speak and when silence kept people safe. This did not feel like one of those times. But he held his tongue and simply moved closer to his grandson, a hand resting on his small shoulder. Nobody in that foyer knew yet that 7 minutes of footage from the hallway camera above the door had gone missing that morning. Nobody knew that the same woman standing in white silk, engaged to one of the wealthiest men in Chicago, had walked past that camera holding something small and glittering and walked back without it. Nobody knew, most of all, that the boy she was humiliating in front of a room full of strangers was the only person in that house who had already discovered the truth she was trying to bury. 6 months earlier, none of this existed. There was no accusation, no frozen staff, no battered backpack turned inside out on marble floors. There was only a man in a wheelchair, alone in a garden, and a boy who noticed something no doctor ever had. If a story like this pulls you in the kind where the quiet ones turn out to be the strongest ones, stay with us. Hit follow now, because what happens next is going to change everything you think you understand about this room. But there was something none of them knew yet. To understand why a 7-year-old boy stood alone in that foyer, accused of a crime he never committed, you have to go back 6 months before the accusation, before the gala invitations, before Sophia Bennett ever learned his name. You have to go back to the day Max Whitmore stopped being able to trust his own legs. Max was 46 years old, the founder of Whitmore Mobility Systems. Oh, sure, medical technology, empire worth billions, built on exoskeletons and smart prosthetics that had helped thousands of patients walk again. Before the accident, he was the kind of man who ran along Lake Michigan every morning before sunrise, who tested his own company's rehabilitation devices on himself before signing off on production. Han had dark hair going silver at the temples, tailored suits that fit like a second skin, and the restless energy of a man who had never once needed to ask for help. Then came the car crash. 6 months of hospitals. 6 months of doctors telling him the damage to his spine was serious but not catastrophic. That recovery, while slow, was expected. Instead, the opposite happened. The cane became a walker. The walker became a wheelchair. His leg muscles thinned week by week. Hy grew tired in the middle of conversations. Every time he tried to stand, his knees folded beneath him like paper. The man who had built a company on the promise of walking again had quietly begun to believe his own legs were dying. That was the man James Carter found sitting alone in the garden behind the Lake Forest estate, staring at the gray surface of the lake. On an afternoon, so cold his breath came out in small white clouds. James wasn't supposed to be there. His grandfather, Robert, had just taken a job as the estate's new gardener, and after school James would sit in the greenhouse with his backpack, waiting for Robert to finish work. How was small for 7, with a serious face that made him look older, dressed in a navy hoodie gone soft from washing, khaki pants a size too big, and sneakers scuffed at the toes. Inside his backpack, a worn paperback, 2 broken crayons, nothing more. I wasn't the kind of child who bragged. I didn't claim to have answers. What he had, what nobody else in that house seemed to have anymore, was the patience to actually look. "I think your legs still work," James said. Max didn't answer right away. I had heard 1,000 people tell him what he wanted to hear. Han hadn't expected it from a child he'd never met. "My doctor can't fix this," he said, half joking, half bitter. "What are you going to do?" James hesitated. I didn't want to sound like he knew everything. "I don't know if I can help," he admitted, "but I can help you try." That single sentence, small, honest, unafraid, was the first crack in 6 months of despair. Want to know how far one honest sentence from a 7-year-old can go? Keep watching, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because this is only the beginning of what James is about to uncover. To understand how Max had lost control of his own life without ever noticing it happening, you have to understand Sophia Bennett. Sophia was 38, the chief strategy officer of Whitmore Mobility Systems, and Max's fiancée. She wore her honey blonde hair perfectly styled, cream-colored suits, silk blouses, minimalist jewelry that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. In public, she was the picture of devotion, the woman who pushed his wheelchair herself, who reminded him to take his medication, who told reporters she would marry him whether he recovered or not. She never threatened. She never raised her voice. Her control came wrapped in soft, reasonable-sounding sentences. "You're too tired to decide right now. I just want to protect you. Let me handle it. Don't think about the company anymore." One by one, small permissions became total control. She answered his emails. She canceled meetings that exhausted him. She decided who was allowed to visit. She chose which doctors treated him, which therapists worked with him. And patiently she began holding his phone at night, so he could rest. Each individual change looked reasonable. Only when you stacked them together did you see the truth. Max Whitmore had slowly disappeared from his own life, and the woman erasing him had convinced everyone, including him, that she was the one saving it. Robert Carter, 67, was the reason James never became reckless with what he noticed. Silver-haired, weathered, built lean but sturdy from decades of physical work. Robert had once been a mobility rehabilitation technician, treating injured veterans at a military facility before retiring into quieter work. I no longer practiced medicine, but the rules he'd lived by never left him, and he drilled them into James constantly. Never give anyone medication without a doctor's approval. Never diagnose an illness. Never push a patient into a dangerous movement. And never trust a suspicion until an independent physician confirmed it. When James told him what he'd done in that garden helped a stranger, a grown man, try to stand, Robert wasn't proud. I was afraid. He reminded his grandson, firmly, that kindness was never an excuse for carelessness. From that day forward, Robert agreed to help only on one condition. Max had to see an independent doctor first. James's father, Michael Carter, had died a year earlier of heart failure, but the story of how he lost everything started 2 years before that. When he worked as a mid-level quality control engineer at Whitmore Mobility Systems, Michael hadn't uncovered some grand conspiracy. He'd noticed something much smaller, a handful of equipment invoices inflated beyond reason, a supplier that seemed to do no actual business, research funds quietly rerouted to a company nobody could identify. He sent his questions up the chain straight into the strategy division Sophia controlled. Within weeks, Michael was accused of accessing data without authorization. I was pushed out in disgrace. A year later, his heart gave out. James barely remembered the details. He only knew his father had once worked for Max Whitmore. and had left that job carrying a shame that was never his to carry. Before he died, Michael used to tell his son one thing, over and over. You don't have to know everything to be allowed to say, something feels wrong. That sentence would matter more than James could possibly understand, not yet. Max didn't confront Sophia. Not yet. Instead, the morning after James's small confession about a pill dropped on the greenhouse floor, Max pretended to swallow his medication and hid it under his tongue instead. Once Sophia left the room, he called his personal lawyer and asked for an independent doctor, someone outside Sophia's carefully curated circle. That doctor was Dr. Emma Collins, 52, a neuromuscular specialist with graying dark hair, thin-framed glasses, and the plain, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years not being impressed by wealth. After examining Max and sending the mystery pill to an independent lab, her findings were careful, unhurried, and devastating. The original spinal injury did not explain his current level of weakness. His leg reflexes were still intact. The pills in his prescription bottle did not match his official medical chart. Several were strong muscle relaxants, the kind that, taken long enough, could cause exactly the symptoms Max had been living with for 6 months. Weakness, drowsiness, loss of balance, if he stopped taking them and followed proper physical therapy. Emma told him. Real recovery was still possible, but she was careful with her words. This isn't proof Sophia switched your medication, she said. All we know right now is that your medication has been switched. It was a warning as much as a diagnosis. Max would have to investigate, not accuse. Not yet. No matter how much his instincts screamed at him to. That night, staring at the pills lined up beside his bed, Max didn't see medicine anymore. He saw a question he could no longer avoid. If his legs weren't failing on their own, who was making them fail? And what did they want in return? Max decided to keep his silence a weapon. He would let Sophia believe her plan was working while he built the case that would undo her. Every morning became a performance. He accepted the pills from Sophia's hand. He placed them on his tongue. He drank water in front of her, smiled his thanks, and waited for her to leave the room. Only then did he spit the pill into a folded tissue. Log the date and time in a small notebook hidden inside a locked metal box, and store it away as evidence. I didn't investigate alone. Each thread of proof went to someone equipped to handle it. Dr. Emma Collins took the medication and the medical charts. His attorney, David Miller, combed through legal paperwork. A financial investigator named Richard Hayes traced the money. The head of estate security reviewed camera footage. Robert oversaw Max's physical recovery. James was never asked to be anything more than what he already was, the first person who noticed, and a witness to what came next. David Miller, 55, had been Max's attorney for over a decade, graying hair, a deep navy suit, and an old leather briefcase that had traveled with him through 100 negotiations. What he found chilled him. Sophia had gotten Max to sign document after document during moments when he was medicated, exhausted, or in pain. Temporary medical decision-making authority, access rights to accounts for treatment purposes, representation authority for certain company meetings, a clause transferring voting power if Max were ever declared legally incapacitated, early paperwork for a post-marital guardianship filing. No single document handed her the company outright, but stacked together, combined with a body that appeared to be failing by the week. They built a legal pathway, one signature at a time, toward complete control. The physical recovery itself unfolded in 3 milestones, each one costing Max more than the last, under Robert's careful supervision. In the humid warmth of the greenhouse, Max gripped the edge of a potting table and pushed himself upright. His legs shook violently. For nearly 10 seconds, he held his own weight for the first time in 6 months. James couldn't contain himself. He let out a whoop of joy loud enough that Max had to shush him, laughing despite the tremor still running through his knees. James clapped both hands over his own mouth, eyes wide, and then the two of them broke into laughter, together, a small, ordinary moment that made their bond feel less like a mission and more like a friendship. A week later, Max pushed too far. I tried to walk the length of the greenhouse unassisted. His knees buckled, and he went down hard onto the concrete floor. James panicked. Howe was certain, in that moment, that he had caused it, that his encouragement had pushed a grown man into an injury far worse than anything doctors had warned about. He cried. Hung said he didn't want to help anymore. Robert knelt down and told him plainly, James was not responsible for curing Max. Adults decided the limits of the training, not a 7-year-old. Helping someone did not mean carrying the weight of every outcome. Max, humbled, admitted the truth himself. He had pushed too hard because he was terrified of losing the company, not because his body was ready. James only agreed to come back after Max promised two things. He would listen to the doctor, and he would never again let James feel like the recovery was his burden to carry. Days before the gala, Robert built 3 low wooden steps inside the greenhouse to mimic a stage. Max trained relentlessly, standing in a full suit, walking without looking down at his feet, holding his balance under bright light, climbing the 3 steps without support, standing long enough to deliver a short speech. Han never fully recovered. His legs still trembled. Han needed to rest after every attempt. But that imperfection was exactly what would make the moment, when it finally came, look like the result of real effort, not a miracle staged for effect. Sophia noticed the changes before anyone told her anything directly. Max seemed more alert. Han ate better. He kept asking to be wheeled out to the garden. She began checking things on her own. She inspected the pill organizer. She rearranged the pill bottles slightly, just to see if Max would notice the difference. She asked staff questions about the gardener's grandson. She tracked Robert's work schedule. She requested camera data from the head of security covering the greenhouse grounds. The cameras themselves couldn't confirm much steam, and overgrown plants blurred most of what happened inside, but Sophia knew, with cold certainty, that the boy was spending an unusual amount of time near Max. She decided to remove him. The trap came wrapped in diamonds. That morning, Sophia deliberately wore a diamond bracelet in front of the staff, making sure it caught the light, making sure it was noticed. Then she disappeared into the staff changing room, used her administrative access to disable the hallway camera for exactly 7 minutes, and slipped the bracelet into the small front pocket of James's backpack. She loosened the latch on a nearby locker, just enough to suggest someone had been rifling through it. Before returning to the main room, she sent a single text message to the housekeeper. "Lily, check the small pocket in the front of the bag." Then she announced, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that her bracelet was missing. She said she had seen James lingering near the hallway. She told Lily to search the boy's bag in front of security, in front of staff, in front of anyone close enough to watch. The bracelet was found exactly where she had placed it. James did not react like a calm, composed adult. He reacted like exactly what he was, a frightened 7-year-old child. His face went pale the instant the bracelet came out of his bag. His hands shook. He cried, terrified of the police, insisting over and over that he hadn't taken anything. He looked to Max, desperate for anyone to step between him and the wall of adult faces staring him down. Sophia declared that the boy had likely invented the story about switched medication to cover up his own theft. Max understood something in that instant. If he confronted Sophia directly, right there, she would have every reason and every opportunity to destroy the larger evidence before anyone could stop her. But understanding that didn't mean he would abandon a terrified child to take the fall alone. He raised his voice, loud enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. "No one calls the police until every camera and every access log has been reviewed." Han gave clear instructions. James's name would not be spoken publicly. No one was to touch him. Robert would take him home immediately, safely. The backpack and the bracelet were to be sealed, untouched. Everyone present was to write down exactly what they had witnessed, in their own words, before memories could be reshaped by gossip. Sophia couldn't object without looking suspiciously desperate to move faster than the situation required. I didn't know it yet, but Max had just placed the first crack in the wall Sophia had spent 6 months building. Even though Max had stopped the police from being called, James still walked away wounded. Max hadn't stood up in that moment and simply said, in front of everyone, "I believe you," and to a 7-year-old. That omission felt like betrayal. Before Robert let him out, James asked one question, his voice small and raw. "Do you think I took it?" Max answered as honestly as he could. "I think someone wanted everyone to believe you did." It wasn't enough. Not for James. He left in tears, saying he never wanted to come back to that house again. This was the moment James stopped being a perfect, endlessly forgiving child in the story of his own life. Han had every right to be angry, afraid, and done trusting people who claimed to be on his side. Sophia had disabled the main hallway camera for 7 minutes, but she didn't know the security system carried 3 additional layers of backup. An administrative log recorded that her account, specifically, had disabled the feed. A hallway camera near the staff room caught her reflection in a decorative mirror, bracelet still on her wrist, and the main server retained several seconds of buffered footage recorded just before the feed cut out entirely. Together, the pieces told an undeniable story. Sophia carrying the bracelet as she entered the room, the camera disabled under her own account, Sophia leaving without the bracelet still on her wrist, and no one else entering the area before James's backpack was searched. Combined with the text message she'd sent Lily, a message no one else had seen until now, the timeline sealed itself shut. It was proof that Sophia had known exactly where the bracelet would be found, because she was the one who had put it there. Max drove to James and Robert's apartment in Chicago himself. He brought no expensive gifts. He didn't try to use his wealth or his name to buy back forgiveness he hadn't yet earned. He showed James the footage. "I know you didn't take it," he said, "and I'm sorry I let you stand there for as long as I did." James was still angry. He asked why Max hadn't defended him outright, in front of everyone. The moment it happened, Max was honest with him. "Because I was afraid she'd realize I was investigating her. But I let a child carry fear that should have been mine to carry. That wasn't fair to you." James didn't forgive him instantly. "I still don't want to go back," he said. Max accepted that. I didn't push. It was only later, when James learned that Max was still swallowing fake medication every single day, still walking straight into potential danger without any protection of his own, that the boy agreed to keep helping but only on one condition. Robert had to be there. Always. Without exception. James's kindness, from that point forward, was no longer innocent instinct. It was a choice made after being hurt, and that gave it far more weight than before. Would you have forgiven Max that quickly? Or made him earn it the way James did? Comment 1 if you'd forgive fast. 2 if you'd make him wait. Richard Hayes, 61, was a financial investigator who had spent years working securities fraud cases before going independent. He wore a gray overcoat, thin wireframe glasses, and had a habit of writing every figure down in pencil, as if ink made mistakes too permanent to fix. Richard uncovered a company called North Star Adaptive Holdings, quietly buying up shares of Whitmore Mobility Systems. The same company was preparing to purchase the patent rights to Max's newest robotic exoskeleton technology at a fraction of its actual value, peeling back layer after layer of shell companies and proxy representatives. The ownership trail led back to 3 names: Sophia, the doctor overseeing Max's official medical file, and a financial advisor closely tied to Sophia's private dealings. The full shape of the conspiracy finally came into view. Weaken Max with the wrong medication. Make his condition appear permanent and irreversible. Use falsified medical reports to declare him unfit to run his own company. Transfer temporary voting power into Sophia's hands. Sell the exoskeleton patent to a company she secretly controlled. Marry him, both to deepen her access to his assets and to soften public suspicion. And if he resisted even after all of that, file for legal guardianship. Emma compared Max's original medical evaluation with the version Sophia had forwarded to the board of directors. The original read: "Recovery potential remains present. Continued monitoring recommended." The version sent to the board read instead: "Irreversible decline. Recovery probability extremely low." Emma found the alterations herself, a conclusion swapped out entirely. One electronic signature copied over onto the falsified version, and a large consulting payment transferred to the doctor shortly after the revised report appeared. David uncovered old emails belonging to James's father. 2 years earlier, Michael Carter had raised questions about this exact company, North Star Adaptive Holdings, back when it still operated under a different name. Sophia, back then, had arranged for access logs to be altered, framing Michael for data theft he never committed. The emails didn't prove the current conspiracy against Max. They proved something else. Something almost worse. Sophia had used this exact method of manufactured blame before, to remove someone who had gotten too close to the truth. It established a pattern consistent, deliberate, and cruel without turning Michael into a man who'd somehow known the full conspiracy all along. And hadn't. He'd simply asked a question no one wanted answered. Sophia was already planning her final move: a gala at Navy Pier. On the surface, the event existed to raise funds for patients with disabilities, showcase new technology, honor Max publicly, and announce their upcoming wedding. Beneath that surface, Sophia intended to have the board vote that very night to formally transfer operational control into her hands. She had prepared a report claiming Max could not stand unassisted, could not maintain focus, showed signs of paranoia, and was being manipulated by a child with an alleged history of theft. The final trap wasn't medical. It wasn't even financial. It was designed so that every single word Max spoke that night would be dismissed as the ramblings of a man who had lost his grip on reality. 3 days before the gala, Max overheard Sophia on the phone, her voice low and certain. After the vote, we file for guardianship. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll already be too late. Max understood then that the gala was no longer a company event. It was the deadline, the last possible moment for him to reclaim control over his own body, his own company, and his own life. The ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan had been dressed in white and blue light for the occasion. Board members, investors, physicians, longtime employees, charity representatives, patients who had once used Max's devices to take their first unaided steps, and half the business press in Chicago. Sophia stood on the small stage in a white gown, radiating the calm authority of a woman who already considered herself the natural heir to an empire. Max was wheeled in wearing a dark navy suit, still visibly weakened, but his eyes were sharper than they had been in months. James stood at the back of the room in a white shirt and navy sweater, beside Robert. Far from the stage, far from the cameras. He still flinched every time someone glanced his way, still half expecting to be called a thief in front of a crowd all over again. Remember, everyone in this room believes James stole a bracelet. Everyone believes Max is a broken man clinging to a woman who saved him. In 60 seconds, every one of those beliefs is about to collapse. Sophia's speech was flawless. She spoke of sacrifice, of loyalty, of the responsibility to protect Max's legacy now that his body had failed him. She unveiled a medical report claiming he was no longer fit to lead the company he'd built. Then, almost gently, she brought up the boy standing at the back of the room. Recently, she said, voice thick with practiced sympathy, Max has been influenced by a child recently caught with stolen property hidden in his backpack. James lowered his head. Robert's hand settled on his shoulder, but he said nothing. This was not his moment to speak for his grandson. Sophia turned back to Max and placed a guardianship authorization in front of him. Pen ready, in full view of the entire board. Sign it, Max, she said, for your own good. Max picked up the pen. I didn't sign. Sophia, he said, his voice carrying further than anyone expected. Are you certain I can't stand? Her smile didn't waver. Max, this isn't the moment to prove a point. Are you certain, he continued, that the pills you've been giving me every morning were the ones my doctor actually prescribed? For exactly 1 second, one single. A mystical second, Sophia's smile froze. It was the first crack in a mask she had worn flawlessly for 6 months. And in that 1 second, something in the room's atmosphere changed. The way air changes just before a storm breaks. She recovered instantly, insisting Max was confused, ordering staff to wheel him out of the hall. I didn't move. Max set the pen down. He reached forward and pulled the blanket off his own lap. He placed both hands on the arms of his wheelchair, and slowly, impossibly slowly, every muscle in the room seemingly holding its breath. Along with him, he began to rise. His legs shook violently. I had to stop halfway, steadying himself for 3 long seconds that felt, to everyone watching, like an eternity. No one spoke. No one moved. 300 people stood in a silence so complete it felt like a held breath about to break a ribcage. Max stood straight. He stepped away from the wheelchair. The first step was slow, unsteady. The second step found more balance. The third step carried him to the edge of the stage. He climbed the 3 steps he had trained on in secret inside a humid greenhouse for weeks. 2, 3, until he was standing directly in front of Sophia. Close enough that she could see every tremor still running through his legs. Close enough that there was nowhere left for her practiced smile to hide. I'm not standing to prove I've fully recovered, Max said. I'm standing to prove that your report is a lie. His ability to walk wasn't the whole case against her. It was simply the final blow to the fragile, carefully constructed image of a broken man. She had spent 6 months building the image everyone in that room had been asked to believe without question. Max didn't begin with the company. I didn't begin with the money. I began with James. The screens behind him lit up, one piece of evidence at a time. On administrative log showing Sophia's account disabling the hallway camera. A mirror reflection catching her holding the missing bracelet. Buffered security footage from the exact minute she claimed nothing had happened. A text message. Time-stamped. Instructing the housekeeper to check the exact pocket where the bracelet would later be discovered. James Carter did not steal anything, Max said, his voice steady. Deliberate. I was framed because he saw something Sophia needed hidden. At the back of the room, James lifted his head. I didn't smile, not yet. His eyes filled with tears, and he reached for his grandfather's hand instead of standing tall and triumphant. It didn't feel like a victory yet. It felt like relief, raw and overwhelming, the kind that comes only after real fear. If you were in that room and heard those words, what would your face have done? Comment your honest reaction below. Dr. Emma Collins stepped forward next, presenting only 3 pieces of evidence, no more. Nothing that would drown the room in medical jargon. Lab results confirming the pills Max had secretly saved were muscle relaxants, not the prescribed medication. A side-by-side comparison showing the difference between his official prescription and what he had actually been given. The original medical evaluation, unaltered. Beside the falsified version sent to the board. Then came the footage silent, but unmistakable of Sophia pouring pills from an unmarked bottle into Max's daily pill organizer with her own hands. No sound was needed. The image spoke for itself. Richard Hayes laid out the financial trail in a simple diagram, refusing to turn the gala into a courtroom lecture. Sophia indirectly owned North Star Adaptive Holdings. North Star was preparing to purchase Max's newest patent for a fraction of its value. Sophia would gain approval authority over that exact transaction if tonight's vote succeeded. The doctor who had falsified Max's medical report had received a large payment from North Star shortly afterward. David Miller handed the complete documentation to the board and to investigators already present in the room. Max introduced James by his full name, James Carter, son of Michael Carter, the engineer who had first raised questions about irregular transactions inside the company 2 years earlier. Michael's old email appeared on the screen. It wasn't the piece of evidence that convicted Sophia. It was the piece that proved a pattern. She had used this exact method manufactured blame, quiet retaliation before, against a man who only asked an honest question. 2 years ago, Max said, we believed Sophia's word and pushed out an honest man. Tonight she tried to do the same thing to his son. James wasn't framed as a boy completing his father's revenge. I was simply a child who had done what his father once taught him, refusing to look away from something that felt wrong. Sophia tried to fight back. She claimed Max was being manipulated. She claimed the footage had been edited. She claimed the medication could have been switched by someone else entirely. She claimed the financial transactions were legitimate business. She claimed James and Robert were seeking a payout. Max didn't answer her with anger. Every denial she offered was met, steadily, by someone with actual expertise. The head of security confirmed the camera data was untouched. Emma confirmed the lab results herself. Richard confirmed the money trail, line by line. David confirmed every falsified document. Lily, pale and shaking, confirmed the text message had come from Sophia's own phone. The room stayed cemetery silent, broken only by the soft click of a projector advancing to the next slide. Sophia's voice, once so smooth and commanding, began to fray at the edges, not because anyone shouted her down, but because the truth no longer had a single source she could discredit. The board acted immediately. The vote was canceled outright. Every authority Sophia held was suspended on the spot. All transactions tied to North Star were frozen. The disputed power of attorney documents were declared invalid pending investigation. Security was instructed to prevent her from accessing any company data. Effective immediately. Max didn't declare her a criminal himself. I didn't need the theater of a courtroom verdict to make his point. Tonight, he said, standing on legs that had trembled through every word, we stop what she was planning. Determining every charge against her belongs to investigators and to the courts, not to me. It was the final proof that Max hadn't simply reclaimed his company. Han had reclaimed his judgment, his patience, and his refusal to become the very thing he'd spent 6 months fighting against. Do you think Sophia's punishment should end with the board, or should it go further? Comment your verdict. Justice didn't end on that stage. It only began there. In the weeks that followed, A formal investigation unfolded, and accountability was measured in careful, deliberate tears, not a single dramatic sentence, but a structure built to actually hold. Sophia faced the heaviest weight of it. Investigators examined the deliberate switching of Max's medication, the physical harm it caused, the financial fraud tied to North Star, the falsified medical records, the frame-up of a 7-year-old child, the manipulation of the company vote, and the guardianship filing built entirely on manufactured evidence. She was removed from the company immediately, stripped of every system, every account, every scrap of access to the life she'd tried to steal. The final legal consequences would rest with the courts, not with a single triumphant sentence delivered under gala lighting. The doctor who had falsified Max's medical evaluation, and who had accepted payment from North Star in exchange for doing it, was suspended from practicing medicine and referred for fraud investigation, facing potential criminal charges alongside civil liability. The financial advisor who had helped construct North Star's shell structure was investigated according to how deeply and how knowingly he had participated. Employees who had actively helped cover the scheme, deleting data, hiding financial trails, altering system timestamps, were evaluated individually. The law and the company made a distinction between those who understood exactly what they were hiding and those who had simply followed instructions without asking questions. Lily Morgan, the head housekeeper, hadn't known about the pills or the plot to seize the company, but she had noticed things that didn't sit right, and she had stayed silent out of fear for her job. She apologized to James publicly. She surrendered every message on her phone. She cooperated fully with investigators. She was suspended from her position. But she was never treated as Sophia's equal in guilt. James didn't say he forgave her right away. "I heard your apology," he told her, "but I need time." It was a small sentence, but it mattered. Forgiveness that comes too easily rarely means anything at all. Most of the board hadn't known about the poisoning. They weren't criminals, but they carried their own share of responsibility for trusting one woman with obvious financial motives without question, for never demanding an independent medical opinion, for discussing Max's competence in front of him without ever once asking what he thought, for quietly equating his physical limitations with a failing mind. Some resigned. The company adopted new safeguards. Any evaluation of incapacity now required 2 independent specialists. No caregiver could simultaneously hold voting authority over the person they cared for, and every related party transaction had to be disclosed in full. Whitmore Mobility Systems formally corrected Michael Carter's employment record. Max admitted, publicly, that the company had failed to protect an employee who had done nothing but ask an honest question. Michael's name was restored not as a grand gesture to erase pain, but as a quiet act of truth. James still didn't have his father back. Nothing could undo that. But he now knew, without doubt, that Michael had never been the dishonest man his old file once claimed. Max stood in front of the company one final time and said something that would follow him for the rest of his life. "James didn't save me with a miracle. He saved me by noticing something wrong and having the courage to say it out loud." He admitted his own failure too, that fear of exposing the investigation had let a child carry a burden that should have been his alone. "I stopped the police that night," he said, "but I still let a boy wonder whether I believed him. That was my mistake to own." When Max offered to create a foundation in James's name, the boy felt uneasy. He didn't want to be treated as someone extraordinary. Instead, with Robert's guidance, he asked for something simpler: a reading room, a free mobility training center, equipment for children and veterans who couldn't afford it themselves. It was named after Michael Carter, not James. That choice said everything about who James was. Max's recovery never became a fairy tale. Months later, he still needed a cane for short distances, still relied on his wheelchair on harder days, still continued physical therapy, still returned to running the company on a limited schedule. I was no longer ashamed to ask for help. He'd learned that victory was never about always standing. It was about deciding, for himself, when to stand, when to sit, and who was allowed a place in his life. In the final scene, Max and James walked together along the lakeside path in Lincoln Park. Max leaned lightly on a cane. James walked beside him, close enough to help, not touching him at all. When Max grew tired, James simply asked, "Do you need to sit?" Max nodded, and they sat together on a bench facing the water. That first day, Max asked. Did you really believe you could make me walk again? James shook his head honestly. Not really. I just thought you deserved to try again. Then why didn't you walk away? James looked out at the lake before answering. Because you looked like someone nobody was telling the truth to anymore. Max said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood, using his cane, finding his balance on his own. James rose beside him, but didn't walk ahead. I waited until Max found his footing, and only then did they walk on together. Kindness is never proof of foolishness. Humility is never the same as silence in the face of wrong. A child's word deserves to be believed and protected. A body that struggles to walk says nothing about the strength of the mind inside it. Control can wear the mask of care. And courage doesn't mean feeling no fear. It means choosing to do the right thing again, even after you've already been hurt once for trying. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us while writing it, you're exactly who this channel is for. We tell stories about the quiet ones who turn out to be the strongest ones in the room. So if you want more of that, hit subscribe. And don't be a stranger. And before you go, have you ever been underestimated, dismissed, or judged by how you looked instead of who you were? Tell us your story in the comments. We read everyone.